Okay, today we're going to talk about what experts generally consider the elements of a good story. What makes a good story, after all? Any answer to this question is bound to be subjective. However, some general observations might be made that will apply to a large variety of film narratives. First, we're going to talk about something we've actually already talked about, and that is a good story is unified in plot. The structured film is one that has some broad underlying purpose or is unified around a central theme. Regardless of the nature of its theme, whether it focuses on plot, emotional effect, character, style, or texture, or structure, or idea, the fictional film generally has a plot or storyline that contributes to the development of that theme. Therefore, the plot and the events, conflicts, and characters that constitute it must be carefully selected and arranged so that the relationship to the theme is clear. The unified plot focuses on a single thread of continuous action where one event leads to another naturally and logically. Usually, a strong cause and effect relationship exists between these events, and the outcome is made to seem, if not inevitable, at least probable. In a tightly unified plot, nothing can be transposed or removed without significantly affecting or altering the whole. Thus, every event grows naturally out of the plot, and the conflict must be resolved by elements or agents present in the plot itself. A unified plot does not introduce out of thin air some kind of chance, coincidental, or miraculous happening, or some powerful superhuman force that swoops down out of nowhere to save the day. It might have those things, but it can't be out of nowhere. Okay, if you recall, we talked about three different ways that a director or a screenwriter can artistically unify a plot. The first one was using the circular story plot structure, that Forrest Gump technique, where the story begins and ends in the same place, kind of. Okay. In addition to that, we talked about reoccurring elements. They can unify the plot by having certain elements in the movie, whether it's scenes, dialogue, whether it's music, like they do in Jaws, to to unify the plot to keep things all kind of tightly knit. And then the third way that they could do this is by using foreshadowing. Ultimately, you've got to foreshadow events that happen later on. If something is introduced at the end of the story, if Jaws is killed by an oxygen tank, that oxygen tank has to be introduced earlier on in the film. A great example of this is from a story that you read as ninth graders, that book Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. And I want to show you this scene right here, and you should be able to recall why this scene is significant to the story of Mice and Men. It's a scene from midway through the book, right after Candy and Lenny and George have scrounged up enough money where they actually think they might be able to buy a place of their own so they can be their own bosses. And then Curly walks in. Let's take a look.
What the hell are you laughing about? Huh? You! Come on, big bastard, get up. That son of a bitch is gonna laugh at me. Get up. I'll show you who's yelling. Get up. I got no call for that stuff. Get up. Come on. Get up. Hey, get up. Get up and fight. Get up and he didn't do nothing. Come on, leave me alone. Cut it out, Curly. Come on, man. Like that. Get him, Lenny. Like that. Get him, Lenny. Get him. Slim, help me. Let go. Lenny. Let go his hand. Let go. You told me to, George. You told me to. No, take it easy. Calm down.
Gotta get up to the doctor. Carlson, get the wagon hitched up and take him into Soul Deck. Get him fixed up.
I knew what I heard him. I knew what I heard him.
It ain't your fault, man. This punk had it coming to him.
Yeah.
Okay, this scene in the film and in the book is really incredibly important to the overall story. Sure, it is a scene where Curly ends up getting what readers want him to get, which is a bloodied hand. Sorry for the violence there, but it's way more than that. It sets up very subtly why the end of the story happens. If you remember, at the end of the book, Lenny is touching Curly's wife's hair. Remember, he has this kind of thing for soft things. He likes to pet the mouse in his pocket and the puppies later on in the story. But he freaks out with Curly's wife, and when she panics, he panics. And you can see that when it's a difficult situation for him, he grabs a hold and does not let go. He can't let go unless he's basically helped out by George or someone else. And so when this happens later on in the story, when Lenny is with Curly's wife, we now understand that he's not an evil person. He just is someone who does not understand his own strength. And when he is dealing with these kinds of difficult sorts of situations, what he does is he holds on. And that's exactly what he does with Curly's wife at the end of the story, and ends up, of course, breaking her neck and killing her. So this scene right here is a necessary scene, basically, to unify the plot. It foreshadows this end, and it gives the reader and the viewer an explanation of why the tragedy at the end occurs. Okay, let's move on to the second element of a good story, and that is that a good story is credible. To become fully involved in a story, we must usually be convinced that it could be true. A filmmaker can create the illusion of truth really in a variety of ways, and the book does a nice job of breaking this down into 3 types of credibility. And the first one is that pardon me, sorry about that. The first one is that a film could have what are known as externally observable truths. And this basically talks about the way things really are. So here, the most obvious and common kind of truth in a film story, is the approximation of life as it is. To borrow Aristotle's phrase, these are stories that might occur and have the capability of occurring in accordance with the laws of probability or necessity. This kind of truth is based on overwhelming evidence in the world around us. So it may not always be a pleasant truth. Human beings are flawed creatures, after all. Married couples don't always live happily ever after, and tragic accidents, serious illnesses, and great misfortunes often befall people who don't seem to deserve them. But we accept such truths because they conform to our own experience of the way life is. And so we see movies like these 3 right here. You might recognize these. This first one right here is Saving Private Ryan. The second one right here is The Pursuit of Happiness. And this one right here is 12 Angry Men. All of these movies are considered credible by audiences not because we've been involved in World War II, or because we've been homeless, or because we've been involved in a court case. It's because we know that these things occur. We've read about World War II in our classrooms, in our history classes. We've certainly read newspaper articles and researched things on poverty. We've walked downtown Ann Arbor and seen people who are asking for spare change. We believe the events in a movie like 12 Angry Men because we've heard about court cases. We've heard about people who have been wrongly accused. We've heard about people who have gotten off who are really actually guilty. So all 3 of these movies work. One reason that they work is that because we generally see them as credible. These things do occur, and we know that not necessarily because we've experienced them, but because we've read about them, we've studied them, we know somebody who's been involved with these things, and that helps make these stories good. Okay, but there are stories where that's not necessarily the case. And a second way that filmmakers establish credibility is through what's known as internal truths of human nature. And so here we're talking about the way things are supposed to be. Okay, so another set of truths seems true because we want to believe or need to believe in these things. Some of the greatest film classics did not even pretend to represent the actualities of real life. Instead, They offer a fairy tale or happily ever ending after happily ever after endings. I think I'll get it. The good guy always wins and true love conquers all. But in a very special way, these stories are also believable, or at least can be made to seem so, because they contain what might be called internal truths, beliefs in things that are not really observable, but that seem true to us because we want them to be or we need them to be. Indeed, the concept of poetic justice, which is the idea that virtue will be rewarded and evil punished, serves as an example of such an internal truth. We seldom question poetic justice in a story simply because it's the way things are supposed to be. Thus, many film stories are convincing because they conform to an inner truth and satisfy a human need to believe. Of course, such truths can ring false to those who do not want or need to believe them. If you think about any Disney movie that ends happily ever after, in reality, this is not what usually happens, unfortunately. But we want it to happen. We feel like we should have everything end happily ever after. One of my favorite examples is the movie Rocky. And Rocky, no one comes out of the theater saying to themselves, Rocky is incredible at all. That could never happen. When in actuality, it probably couldn't ever happen. It's about a guy who boxes on Friday nights at a local gym, and in those local fights, he ends up getting his face punched in by amateurs. He gets the opportunity to fight the heavyweight champion of the world, who's modeled after Muhammad Ali, the greatest fighter of all time. And after training for 6 months, he manages to stay in the ring for 15 rounds against the greatest fighter in the world. This is probably, to say the least, a long shot. Let's be honest. If any of us got a chance to face Mike Tyson, even if we had 6 months of training, it wouldn't take too long for him to take us down. This works, however, because we like Rocky and we feel like somebody who works hard should be able to win or at least hang in there in this sort of situation. So therefore, it works on a credibility scale. Okay, and then the last one that we have, the chapter describes this as the artistic semblance of truth. And this is talking about stories and things that don't generally talk about stories that actually have happened. So here we're talking about the way things never were and never will be. Filmmakers are also capable of creating this special kind of truth. With their artistry, technical skills, and special effects, they can create an imaginary world on the screen that, for the duration of the film, seems totally believable. In such films, truth depends on the early and thoroughly convincing establishment of a strange or fantastic environment, sense of another time, or unusual characters, so that we are caught up in the film's overall spirit, mood, and atmosphere. If the filmmaker is skillful at creating this semblance of truth, we willingly agree to suspend our disbelief, and we leave our skepticism and our rational faculties behind as we enter the film's imaginary world. If the fictional reality is successfully established, we may think to ourselves, yes, in such a situation, almost anything can happen. By communicating this pervasive and real sense of an unusual situation or environment, filmmakers, in effect, create a new set of ground rules by which we judge reality. For the brief period of 2 hours or so, we can believe thoroughly in the truth of movies like The Lord of the Rings, or The Wizard of Oz, or E.T., or Star Wars. The movie that seems to fit into this category the best from your generation would be my kids' favorite, which would be the Harry Potter series. They are so well developed, so detail-oriented by J.K. Rowling, it seems like this world has got to exist. It can't possibly be something that somebody made up. And so that suspense of belief it works for us because it's so well developed. Okay, please select the next video and we'll talk about a couple more things.